Marine Corps Private Rachel Harner didn't believe in marriage until she fell in love with the most amazing man.
Michael changed my perception on how relationships should be.
She was just so happy, and they were really just perfect for each other.
But just when Rachel thought Michael Parson was her true love, she'd discover the man of her dreams was a monster in disguise.
I got the gut feeling that he was hiding something.
He didn't care who he hurt, how he hurt them.
He had done such a horrible, horrible thing. I just kept saying, oh my God, oh my God, oh my God.
When it comes to love and marriage, things aren't always as they seem. In April 2010, love and marriage were the last things on 19-year-old Rachel Harner's mind.
I didn't actually plan on getting married, ever. I just come out of a relationship that didn't really end well. I just knew that it was going to take a little bit of time before I was willing to invest myself again.
But while Rachel was flighty in love, the Georgia girl was rock solid in her commitment to everything else, especially her duties as a reservist in the U.S. Marine Corps.
I loved it. At the time that I was waiting to be deployed, I was working as a waitress and a bartender. I was very, very busy.
And Rachel was also hunting for a third job to help ends meet.
I've always loved animals, and I wanted to work at a pet store. So I printed out an application, I filled it out, and I walked in.
Rachel couldn't help but feel like a smitten kitten when she first laid eyes on the manager conducting her interview, Michael Parson.
I noticed him right away. I thought he was very handsome. He had beautiful, smooth skin and a very intoxicating voice.
Tell me about yourself.
During the course of the interview, I told him that I was a Marine, and he pulled out his dog tags.
Yeah, I was in the Navy Corps.
I just kind of thought, ka-ching.
Michael told Rachel he'd been deployed to Iraq and received a Purple Heart after an IED exploded.
Michael said that he went to Iraq twice, and he had injured his lower back. I liked his military background.
3 days later, Michael offered Rachel the job, which she accepted with every intention of keeping her little crush in check.
Hey, Rachel, how are you?
But as the weeks passed, her feelings for Michael only grew.
Rachel would go on and on about Michael. It was a friendship that was definitely blossoming, and it was special to her.
After learning from coworkers that Michael was single, Rachel asked him out for lunch.
Michael was very surprised, but he said yes.
I'd love to, yeah.
As the two chatted over barbecue, Michael mentioned he was 28, nearly 10 years Rachel's senior.
So that doesn't matter.
I was intimidated by the fact that he was older, smarter, more mature. But I was attracted to him. When we left, he kissed me. At first, I kind of just wanted friendship, but I was interested in Michael in a more than friendly way. And so, inevitably, me and Michael became intimate.
By October of 2010, it became clear that Rachel and Michael were more than just friends with benefits.
When Rachel would start talking about Michael and her eyes would just kind of glaze over, you can tell there's no way she's letting him go.
For the first time, I could imagine growing old with somebody. And it hit me like a ton of bricks.
The couple did their best to see each other as often as their busy schedules would allow.
I was working 3 jobs, but for the most part, we spent a great deal of time with each other. And I would stay at his place, and he would stay at mine.
But when Rachel stayed at Michael's apartment, she couldn't help but notice something strange.
There was a lot of feminine products around. He had female shampoo and conditioner, brushes, and things that I wouldn't have expected. It didn't seem to fit because he was single.
This strange discovery was just the tip of the iceberg. And soon, Rachel would discover just how far and deep Michael's secrets actually went.
His whole life was a lie.
He's a monster. It's incomprehensible.
I was in shock. I refused to believe that Michael had done this. I did not know this man.
By October of 2010, Rachel Harner was head over heels for her new boyfriend, Michael Parson, but confused by the discovery of some feminine products in his home.
I wouldn't have expected a homegrown bachelor like him to have them. So I asked him, why do you have so much female stuff?
Any doubts Rachel might have had soon disappeared.
He informed me that his aunt, Adina, stayed with him while she was building a house in Atlanta.
This is her stuff.
And he showed me a photo, and I was like, wow, she's very beautiful. How old is she? And he said, late 40s. I understood. It's something that I would do for my family and vice versa.
But it wasn't always easy. Aunt Adina's visits forced Michael to sleep on the sofa.
He would complain the next day because his back would hurt from his injury. And I told him, just make her sleep on the futon. He's like, I'm not going to do that to my aunt.
But the pain in his back became so bad that Michael went for a scan of his spine and was given some horrible news.
Michael called me and he said he had spinal cancer. We were both shocked. I felt like I had found this beautiful, wonderful treasure, and all of it was about to get taken away from me.
Michael told Rachel he would have to go through chemo and radiation to stand a fighting chance.
She was very interested in finding more about it. She got really into natural remedies, things that would help the nausea. She wanted to make sure he's eating right, sleeping right.
But Michael's scheduled treatments always seemed to coincide with Rachel's mandatory military events. And in May, this Georgia girl received orders to complete training at Camp Lejeune in North Carolina.
I was very upset about it because I really wanted to be there for Michael. I always just assumed it was bad timing.
Soon, Michael was too frail to continue working at the pet store and had to take a job working at home for a phone company instead.
Michael lost a lot of weight. And he would throw up so frequently and so violently that sometimes there would be blood. We were very frightened because nothing seemed to be working.
So when Michael told Rachel that his only hope was laser radiation surgery and that the top facility for the procedure was in South Carolina, Rachel didn't think twice.
The surgeries were incredibly expensive. I left my car with him when I was stationed at Camp Lejeune for my training. And I told him that he should sell it, and whatever he could get from it, he should use it on his surgery.
Rachel just wanted to be there for Michael, do anything and everything she could, just to help him through it.
I was determined not to let this beat us.
In May of 2011, Michael told Rachel he underwent surgery and things couldn't have gone better.
He would have to do it a couple more times, but for the most part, it had worked. I was so relieved.
And when Rachel learned that she would deploy to Afghanistan in 4 months, she knew their love could endure the distance.
I had no doubts. I had absolute 100% confidence in Michael.
Rachel even made Michael the main beneficiary of all her military assets.
He would receive all of the money I had in my accounts. I put all of my belongings in storage.
Where'd you get this from?
My friend asked me to hold on to his pistol. I had a lot of equipment, and I packed every worldly possession I owned, and Michael had the key.
But as July 4th approached, Michael wanted one more thing from Rachel.
Me, Michael, and my family were just hanging out. And Michael just pulled out a ring and said, Rachel, you're the most beautiful woman in the world.
Will you marry me?
I was like, of course. It was exactly what I wanted. I was ecstatic.
I could tell she was surprised. I really still felt that she was too young, but she was definitely happy.
Only one major hurdle stood between Rachel, Michael, and wedded bliss: deployment.
I was deploying to Afghanistan. I was very scared, but I believed in Michael, and I had faith in him.
Who could have known what a tragic mistake that would be? Especially when long-distance love turned into unimaginable lies.
He had this whole different life, and Rachel didn't have a clue.
Michael was able to manipulate people his entire life.
I had been betrayed and tricked. I felt all the blood drain from my face.
In the fall of 2011, after accepting her boyfriend Michael Parsons' wedding proposal, Rachel Harner was stationed in Afghanistan for 7 months.
The number one thing that made it easier to endure was Michael, and in the scariest moments of my time in Afghanistan, Michael was the one I was thinking of.
Even though Michael's cancer was officially in remission, Rachel still wished she could be there for him.
Rachel and Michael communicated in every way you could think of long distance, even though she was so far away.
I only had one opportunity to video chat Michael during my deployment. It's the first time I'd seen his face in 5 or 6 months, and I was very excited about it.
But Rachel's excitement quickly turned to shock.
As I was talking to him, a woman walked into his office. And she walked right up to him and just leaned forward and kissed him on the lips. I lost my mind. I said, "Who's this woman?" He said, "That's my aunt."
She needs someplace to stay.
And I was like, "She kissed you on the lips. That's not something your aunt does."
Michael tried to calm his fiancée down.
He's like, "That's just the way our family is."
We're just an affectionate family.
And after a little bit of arguing, I accepted his explanation. He told me all about her, and so I ended up apologizing to Michael.
It's all right.
And I said, I have insecurities because we've been away from each other for the past 5 months.
A few weeks later, Rachel received some exciting news. She would be returning to the States.
I was ecstatic. And I felt like there was nothing that was going to stand in our way.
In April 2012, the couple finally reunited at Camp Lejeune.
Rachel and I got back from Afghanistan, and I just see Rachel run into Michael's arms. And there's just the look on her face of just pure joy.
The happy couple went to a nearby hotel room and spent 3 days catching up. After a few more days on the base, Rachel finally returned to Atlanta, and the two lovebirds went to dinner with her parents.
At the dinner table, they were just holding hands. He was feeding her bites of his food from his plate, just talking about how happy they were that she's home.
That night, the couple settled into another hotel, since Aunt Adina was in town once again. 4 days later, they parted ways.
I had to go back to Augusta because I was still on active duty. So I kissed him, and I told him I loved him, and I was going to see him that weekend.
But around 10 o'clock that evening, Rachel was startled by a knock on her door.
I opened up the hotel room door, and it was the police. And they were like, "Rachel Harner?" I was like, "Yes, sir, that's me." He's like, "Do you know Michael Parson?" I was like, "Yes, sir. What's going on?"
I need you to come with us.
And what they said next was just the beginning of a nightmare that would consume Rachel's life for years to come.
All the lies that Michael had told her began to unravel.
What Michael did was sickening.
I did not believe what I was hearing. I just kept saying, "Oh my God, oh my God, oh my God."
If you have a story for Who the Bleep and would like to appear on the series, go to investigation.discovery.com. In April 2012, Rachel Harner was stunned to find police at her hotel room, asking about her fiancé, Michael Parson.
And they drove me to the police department, and they took me to an interrogation room. I was like, I don't know what's going on. All I know is I'm really freaked out right now.
Rachel could hardly believe her ears when investigators began questioning her about Michael's wife.
I was like, Michael can't be married. He's not. We're engaged. I was like, we're getting married in October. There's no way that he can be married.
And that's when police said the words that would change her life forever.
Michael Parsons' wife was Adina Parson.
I was in shock. They showed me a picture of her, and I said, that's his aunt. And he said, no, that's his wife. They'd been married for a few years.
And that was just the beginning of the lies.
We informed Rachel that Michael was 42, not 30 years old. He was married before Adina, and that he had a child living in South Carolina.
I felt all the blood drain from my face because I realized his cancer treatments were in South Carolina.
That's when police dropped yet another bombshell.
The hospital records showed that Michael had never received any type of treatment for any type of cancer whatsoever.
I refused to believe it, and I argued with him. I looked them right in the eye, and I said, he threw up in front of me, he was ill, he lost weight. I do not know how Michael lost all that weight or why he was sick.
But the harder Rachel tried to defend Michael's character, the more holes police poked in his stories.
Michael was in the military but never served overseas or in any type of combat situation. His injuries were from falling off of a roof.
I was confused and upset, and I was in complete and utter denial.
Police clearly had Rachel's attention, and next they delivered the most shocking blow of all.
On April 20th, Michael made a phone call to Adina to lure her out of their apartment complex. When Adina came out, he was there waiting for her to come outside. She was shot 2 to 3 times in the head, and then was shot 5 to 6 times across her body. We believe Michael planned this attack.
Police revealed Adina had survived, but was in critical condition.
Michael had shot his wife. And less than 24 hours later, he was in my arms after he had done such a horrible, horrible thing. I did not believe what I was hearing. I just kept saying, oh my God, oh my God, oh my God. And then Detective McGinnis described the make model of the gun. And it happened to be the exact same gun that was in my storage unit, and Michael had the key. It finally hit me that Michael had committed this crime. I couldn't deny it anymore.
On May 5th, 2012, Michael Parson was found hiding out in Texas. He was arrested and extradited to Georgia. Michael was charged with attempted murder, aggravated assault and battery, and making false statements to the police.
Michael never admitted his guilt, but we believe Michael's motive in this shooting was so that he could go ahead and marry and spend the rest of his life with Rachel Hunter.
I don't believe necessarily that Michael did this as an act of love so much as an act of cold, calculating indifference.
He's a monster. I was full of rage. It's incomprehensible, and it disgusted us.
She had no idea that everything about him was a lie. What Michael did to her was sickening. It was just gruesome.
On May 20th, 2013, Michael Parson went to trial and pleaded not guilty, but his lies ultimately caught up with him. 3 days later, he was convicted of all charges. He received a 35-year prison sentence.
It doesn't undo the damage that's been done. There's been justice, but everybody who has been touched by Michael Parson has been irrevocably damaged.
Today, Rachel is still bothered by the clues she overlooked.
The single most thing that I regret is not saying, you know what, I'd like to meet Adina. It could have changed the entire outcome.
And she still has no idea how Michael was able to fake cancer so convincingly.
I don't know if he took weight pills or got his hands on actual chemo pills. I don't know what Michael did to make himself sick.
While Rachel didn't suffer like Adina, she is also a victim of Michael Parsons' betrayal.
I think Rachel will never be able to trust the way she used to trust, but everything she does now shows me that she has hope.
The man I love doesn't exist. It's like being in love with a character in a book. He was never real.
"27-year-old Jamie Hart was losing faith that he'd ever lay eyes on that special someone. Until he met an ambitious teaching assistant named Melissa Stredney.
I found her quite attractive. She was kind of quirky, kind of funny. She seemed to be a free spirit.
Jamie was in love with her, and this is the woman he wanted to be in his life.
But behind Melissa's pixie style and pretty face was a turbulent past.
She was definitely in a downward spiral. They didn't know what she might do next.
And by the time Jamie saw what he was in for, there was no getting out.
Jamie never believed that she would go to the extreme that she did.
I said, you don't want to do this. I remember my vision going black.
When it comes to love and marriage, things aren't always as they seem. Columbus, Ohio resident Jamie Hart had done his fair share of dating, but had never found the one connection that clicked.
I was just kind of looking for someone to go on a few dates with and see if there was any chemistry.
The 27-year-old collections agent always tried to keep a positive attitude. So in the early summer of 2008, while waiting for coffee at his local cafe, Jamie exchanged smiles with an attractive girl in line.
The line was extremely long. I made the comment, man, we're going to be here for a while. And she kind of chuckled and said,
Yeah, it looks like we are.
And we just kind of started talking back and forth.
The young woman introduced herself as Melissa Stredney. And when their coffee came, Jamie decided to keep the ball rolling.
So we just sat down and had a conversation for about an hour or so. I found her quite attractive. She seemed kind of quirky, kind of funny. She seemed to be a free spirit, but well-adjusted.
And Jamie was impressed by the 27-year-old's drive and ambition.
She had her bachelor's degree already. She was a graduate teaching assistant for the chemistry department in a local university here. She had a lot of things going for her.
After exchanging phone numbers, Jamie was pleased when Melissa texted him almost immediately about seeing a movie together. The date went so well, soon the two were inseparable.
As the relationship progressed, there was more and more chemistry. I found myself falling in love with her.
Before Jamie knew it, he and Melissa were in a hot and heavy committed relationship just a few months into dating.
He was excited at that time, but me and my wife, we were kind of taken back as to how sudden things were developing in the relationship. But Jamie sounded extremely happy.
Still, Jamie was hesitant when, after 6 months together, Melissa asked him to move in with her.
It kind of seemed like the natural progression of how the relationship was going. But Melissa was moving a little bit more quickly than I was ready to do.
For the first time, Jamie gently put on the brakes. After all, they hadn't been through any of life's trials and tribulations yet. That is, until February that year.
Melissa told me that she was going to resign her position from the university. She didn't really go into detail why, just say there was a misunderstanding with her and some of the students. when I kind of probed about what the misunderstanding was. Melissa was upset, angry, so I didn't really question it.
Jamie wasn't sure what to think, but as the weeks passed, Melissa couldn't seem to stop crying.
She told me that she had depression and some anxiety issues that she was battling with for a few years. She went into a local hospital for depression. So I'm like, this must be a pretty bad spell. But there's a lot of people in the world that do battle depression. So it wasn't anything to stop me from continuing to see her.
Jamie was relieved when Melissa was discharged a week later.
She was taking medication and seeing a therapist once or twice every few weeks. That zeal and passion for life returned. She seemed to be back to her normal self.
Then Melissa told Jamie she had a big surprise for him.
She was at my apartment. She presented me with a card. And it said, "Congratulations, you're going to be a father." And I'm like, wow. All right, that's exciting.
Jamie was even more stunned when Melissa said she wasn't just pregnant, she was expecting triplets.
My reaction to that was shock. I wasn't out of the realm of possibilities in my mind because twins run in my family. Even though I was worried, like, how are we gonna do this? Being a father was one of my dreams.
But before long, his excitement would turn into heartache, and then horror.
Everywhere he went, she would show up.
She knew exactly what she was doing.
This was not the person I fell in love with. This was the ultimate betrayal.
In April of 2010, Jamie Hart and his girlfriend, Melissa Stredney, were expecting triplets.
There's that initial shock. There was that sense of excitement and happiness that comes with that.
He was ecstatic, nervous, freaked out, every emotion that you could feel. And he really took that responsibility seriously.
And since Melissa seemed to be doing so well with her antidepressants, Jamie felt it was time to take the next step in their relationship. Jamie moved in with Melissa, and the couple set a wedding date for October of that year.
I thought things were just moving too fast, and we even mentioned it to him. Are you sure this is something you want to do this early? And he said, yeah, this is what I want.
And as Jamie focused on his future with Melissa, he became even more excited about being a father.
I wanted to be an active member. These were my children that she was carrying, so I wanted to be there for every milestone.
But when Melissa started scheduling prenatal visits without him, Jamie couldn't help but feel slighted.
They always seemed to be when I was working or when I had other obligations. I would say, if you're having an appointment, let me know. I can get those days off. And she said she didn't want to burden me with that because we were in a little bit of financial difficulty, so missing work wasn't really an option.
But when Melissa shut Jamie out of a major pregnancy milestone, he grew flat out angry.
Sometime in the late stages of the first trimester, Melissa told me that she got an ultrasound. And I went, oh, awesome, can I see it? She said, well, my dad wanted to see it and I already mailed it to him. Why would you send it to your father but not let the father of the children see it? And I was quite upset that she did that. I wanted to be there for every appointment, and I made it very clear that that was very important to me.
Sadly, he wouldn't get the chance.
A few days later, I came home and Melissa was distraught, and she told me that she went to the hospital that day and that she actually miscarried. You know, I did my best to comfort her. I was in a state of shock. Both of us shed a lot of tears that night.
Jamie barely had time to feel his own grief before Melissa plunged back into a dark depression. Jamie even found himself questioning his desire to get married now that they were no longer expecting.
I had serious thoughts about ending the engagement, but I kind of thought to end a relationship, especially someone you loved, after they had a miscarriage would be unforgivable.
He had already asked her to marry him, and he wanted to do the right thing as far as not abandoning her.
Then, almost overnight, Jamie saw an entirely different side to Melissa.
She would call me like worthless, just anything that she could think of. I would just kind of zone her out and not really hear what she was saying.
Until one night, when Melissa took her abuse to the next level.
It was like 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning. I woke up and she was over top of me, just swinging away, physically assaulting me. She was telling me to get out of the house.
But when Jamie tried to leave, Melissa suddenly apologized.
She kind of made it into like, if I would have left, I would be abandoning her.
Jamie decided to let the incident slide, but despite his best efforts at keeping Melissa calm, there was no peace on the horizon. And before long, Jamie would realize his unhappy fiancée wasn't just miserable, she was monstrous.
She was very angry. Who knew what she was capable of?
It was crazy. He never believed that she would do that.
She knew where I would be. It was becoming more and more scary. I was thinking, how much longer can she do this?
In September of 2010, Jamie Hart's fiancée, Melissa Stredney, was becoming volatile after a miscarriage.
She was verbally abusing me and she was physically assaulting me. Even though she was suffering from depression, I was turning more and more into the victim.
She would threaten to commit suicide if he left. I think he had a sense of responsibility to her. He really was deep into that caregiver role.
Then one night, Jamie woke up to a frightening sight.
Melissa was awake, and I was like, what are you doing up? And she's like,
I can't sleep.
And then I see that she has in her hands a kitchen knife. I'm kind of dazed and confused. I'm like, why do you have a knife? Her only response was,
I can't sleep. I can't sleep.
Jamie stayed calm and gently took the knife from Melissa's hand.
I was more concerned she was going to hurt herself than myself. I ended up staying up with her the rest of the night. She eventually kind of dozed off.
The following morning, Jamie reached out to Melissa's therapist. And soon Melissa was on some new medication. But Jamie was torn.
I was very upset. This woman was completely different than the woman that I met initially. But I can't abandon her. I was concerned about how she was going to get by if I would have left.
But just a few days later, Jamie finally reached his breaking point.
One evening I came home from going out with a friend. I noticed that Melissa was gone, which was kind of strange. But I also noticed some of my personal belongings were gone. There were mementos, photos, miscellaneous records, totally missing. I immediately called her and asked her where my belongings were. She just laughed and hung up on me. It was at that moment that I made the decision that I had enough. These were things that I would never be able to replace. She was stealing my memories. I called my father up and we packed up as much stuff as I could in my car and his car and left.
It was a separation of not only ending the relationship, but ending him knowing Melissa altogether.
But Melissa wasn't going to let Jamie go without a fight.
She was starting to send me threatening messages, saying that she would find me and stab me. They were always of physical harm. She knew where I would be at certain times of the day. It was becoming more and more scary. She would show up 1, 2, sometimes 3 times a week and try to confront me. I started trying to alter my patterns or places where I would be.
But Melissa would not be ignored. On December 14th, 2010, Jamie bundled up and drove into work. As he exited his car, braced against the freezing wind, he found himself facing something much colder.
I only made it about 10 feet from my car, where I was immediately stopped by Melissa. I asked her what she was doing here. Melissa turned to me and said, "Get in my car or else." And I'm like, "Excuse me?"
Knowing instinctively not to get in, Jamie attempted to reason with Melissa.
And she pulled out a silver and black handgun. I was shocked, scared. I said, "What are you doing? You don't want to do this. Please put the gun away." At that moment, time kind of stopped for me. When it was clear to her that I was not going to get into her car, she shot me. I remember my vision going out black.
Pierced by the bullet in his left eye, Jamie's light dimmed and his sight vanished as Melissa fled the scene.
Melissa immediately pulled out of the parking lot. 8 separate people saw this incident, and were already on the phone with the police.
Emergency vehicles were dispatched as authorities hurtled down Ohio highways to find and stop an armed madwoman.
It was like pulling a pin on a grenade.
Police were converging on the area. They didn't know what she might do next.
If you have a story for Who the Bleep and would like to appear on the series, go to investigation.discovery.com.
On December 14th, 2010, police were hunting Jamie Hart's ex-fiancée, Melissa Stredney, after she fired a bullet into his face and fled. Within minutes, an officer locked onto Melissa's car.
Police officer pulled out behind her, lights and sirens signaling her to pull over. She would not stop.
As Melissa accelerated toward a busy intersection, the quick-thinking policeman made a tough decision.
He executed a maneuver in which he rammed the back of her car. With guns drawn, other officers converged. They didn't know if she still had that gun in the car or not. They didn't know what she might do next. They were able to pull her out of the car at gunpoint and take her into custody at that point.
Melissa slowly surrendered, but the gun was missing.
Melissa told the police that as she pulled out of the parking lot and onto the main road, she had pitched a gun out the window. They started walking from the point of where she left the business to the point of where she was arrested, and they were able to find the gun.
Melissa was charged with 5 felonies, including attempted murder and kidnapping. Meanwhile, Jamie was rushed to the nearest hospital.
I was instantly in shock. That was kind of a sleepless night for us. We were numb. Jamie, he was just in our prayers.
Miraculously, Jamie survived, but the bullet had completely destroyed his left eye, shattering his skull and entering the base of his tongue. Luckily, the bullet never pierced his brain.
They had to surgically remove the eye. It was shocking to see him laying there. It was very emotional.
Jamie's sight returned in his right eye, and as he healed, he began to see the full extent of Melissa's deceptive nature, starting with the misunderstanding with her job at the university.
Melissa told me that she resigned her position. What I later came to find out, she was fired from the university.
Apparently, Melissa had encouraged her lab class to cheat and to leave early. When some of the students reported her, she went on the offensive.
She followed up with making threatening emails to the students to the point where the police became involved. No formal charges were filed, but she was dismissed from her position.
And Jamie couldn't help but wonder if Melissa had lied about other things, too.
I ended up having doubts about whether the whole pregnancy was made up. I wasn't able to go to any of the doctor appointments. Never saw the ultrasound. I only had her word that she miscarried.
As Jamie tried to come to grips with all that had happened, Melissa claimed the shooting was an accident.
How did it go?
I don't know. I wasn't even holding the trigger at first. I'm not really a murdering person.
But when witnesses reported to police that Melissa aimed to kill, her defense shifted. to an insanity plea. She described a lifelong battle with mental illness.
I was diagnosed with major depression when I was 12 and I was in a mental institution for 6 weeks. I went to the hospital in November because I'm bipolar and I went manic.
But Melissa's actions after she shot Jamie left her defense full of holes.
She fled the scene. She got rid of evidence. She was rational. She was goal-directed. There's lots of bipolar people out there that don't commit violent crimes of this nature. She knew what she did was wrong.
On June 21st, 2011, just 6 months after her vicious attack, Melissa finally accepted a plea deal to the lesser charges of felonious assault and tampering with evidence. She was sentenced to 15 years in prison.
I really wasn't happy with the 15 years. I think she uses her mental illness as an excuse for a lot of her actions. She knew exactly what she was doing that day. Her goal that day was to end my life.
Today, after 8 surgeries, Jamie's left eye socket and cheekbone have been successfully reconstructed.
They actually split his skull to go in and try to build up the cheekbones. That's pretty major surgery. He really hung in there. He's very brave.
But the emotional damage has been far worse.
I'm very guarded. I now have anxiety, post-traumatic stress, the nightmares that I suffer.
Though he'll never again see with his left eye, Jamie's vision of his future is clear.
This whole experience, it's made me more humble in the grand scheme of things. Every one of us want to be happy, and that's kind of what I'm seeking now, is just happiness.
The phone rang at 2:17 a.m., sharp enough to slice the quiet of a city that never truly sleeps, and on the other end was a voice that hadn't spoken to police in more than 30 years, a voice that carried the weight of an old winter, a locked door, a body found too late, and a truth that had learned how to hide. New York, 1991, the year the city breathed smoke and sirens, the year headlines screamed about crime like it was weather, the year one death slipped through the cracks and became a cold case before anyone realized it would refuse to stay buried. The caller didn't ask for a lawyer, didn't ask for mercy, only said a name that still lived in the archives and then went silent. And in that silence, investigators felt the past shift, like something long frozen beginning to thaw. Back then it started with a hallway that smelled of bleach and old heat, a 4th-floor walk-up on the Lower East Side where the radiator hissed like a warning, and the neighbors had learned not to look too closely at anything. The victim was young, known but not famous, ordinary enough to disappear without the city noticing right away, found sprawled in an apartment that showed no sign of forced entry, no overturned furniture, no cinematic struggle, just the wrong stillness of a life interrupted. The clock on the stove blinked 12 o'clock, power lost and restored sometime during the night. A useless witness to whatever had happened between last contact and discovery. Police marked the scene, snapped photos, bagged what they could, and tried to build a story out of fragments that didn't want to fit. Outside, the street kept moving. Taxis honked. Someone laughed too loudly. A bodega door chimed open and shut, and the city swallowed the shock almost immediately. Inside the apartment, there were small details that refused to explain themselves. A glass on the counter with a lipstick smudge that wasn't the victim's shade, a jacket draped over a chair that no one could place, a faint chemical smell that might have meant nothing or everything. The medical examiner would later note injuries that suggested violence but not frenzy, control without hesitation, an ending that came fast and left little behind. Cause of death was clear enough to close a report, but motive stayed slippery, and motive is where cases begin to rot. Detectives knocked on doors, questioned neighbors who shrugged and said they'd heard nothing unusual, because in that building unusual was normal. Friends were interviewed, lovers scrutinized, co-workers asked to remember the last conversation, the last plan, the last promise. Everyone had a version. None of them lined up. One witness mentioned a man seen entering the building late. Another insisted it was a woman. Someone else recalled raised voices that might have been the television. Tips came in, then thinned out, then stopped altogether. The file grew heavier while the trail grew cold. In the early days, there was confidence, the kind that comes with fresh coffee and full notebooks, with the belief that time is on your side. Detectives circled names, chased leads that led to nothing, checked alibis that dissolved under scrutiny, but never quite collapsed. A boyfriend with a temper, but a solid timeline. A neighbor with a record, but no connection. A stranger who vanished as quickly as he appeared. Each angle promised clarity and delivered fog. Evidence that seemed important one day became irrelevant the next. The city moved on. The case slid down the priority list, and the word cold case began to hover, unspoken but inevitable. Years passed. The files were boxed. The faces in the photographs aged only in the memories of those who still remembered them, and the victim's family learned the particular ache of unanswered questions, the way hope dulls instead of disappearing, the way anniversaries become quieter but heavier. Every so often, a detective would pull the file, read it again, see if something new jumped out, but the pages told the same stubborn story. No confession, no weapon, no clear motive, just a death that refused to explain itself. Then came technology, the promise that science could speak where witnesses could not. Old evidence was re-examined, fibers analyzed with better tools, traces tested that once would have been ignored. There were moments of excitement, brief flares of possibility, a partial profile here, an inconclusive result there. Not enough to charge, not enough to close. The cold case stayed cold, a quiet embarrassment in a system built on resolutions. And yet, somewhere in the city, someone remembered. Someone carried the weight differently, not as a question but as a secret, a story rehearsed and revised over decades, a version of events polished smooth by repetition. When the phone rang in that precinct at 2:17 a.m., it was as if the past had finally decided to speak, but not to explain itself fully, not to offer clean answers, only to crack the surface and let something darker show through. The voice named the victim, named the year, named the building, details that hadn't been public in a long time, details that made seasoned investigators sit up straight and listen. They listened as the caller described a night in fragments, a meeting that wasn't planned, a conversation that went wrong, anger that rose, and then something else that took its place, colder, more deliberate. There were pauses, long enough to suggest memory struggling against fear, or guilt deciding how much to reveal. The voice claimed responsibility, but responsibility is not the same as truth, and detectives knew better than to trust a confession without proof. False confessions had haunted this city before. Still, some details matched, and that was enough to reopen a file that had been gathering dust for 3 decades. As dawn crept over Manhattan, the city unaware that an old wound had been torn open, investigators began retracing steps they'd memorized years ago. Addresses had changed, witnesses had moved or died, the neighborhood had been gentrified into something almost unrecognizable. The building still stood, though, its hallways repainted, its stairs worn smooth by generations of feet. Standing there again, detectives felt the strange vertigo of time folding in on itself, the sense that the past was close enough to touch. The confession, if that's what it was, raised as many questions as it answered. Motive shifted depending on which detail you believed. The timeline bent under scrutiny. There were omissions that felt intentional, gaps where something important should have been. The voice had named accomplices who couldn't be found, mentioned objects that had never been logged into evidence, suggested a version of events that clashed with the medical examiner's report. And yet some things lined up too perfectly to ignore. Word leaked, as it always does, and the headlines came fast, bold type announcing a cold case cracked, a confession that stunned investigators, a promise of closure after 30 years of silence. The community reacted with a mix of relief and skepticism because they'd seen this before, the way hope can be manufactured by a single phone call. Families of the victims spoke carefully, unwilling to celebrate until something solid emerged, until the story stopped shifting under their feet. Inside the precinct, the mood was tense, electric, the air thick with possibility and doubt. Detectives argued over interpretations, over whether the confession was a gift or a trap, whether they were finally close to the truth or being led down another dead end. Every old piece of evidence was pulled again, every note reread, every photograph examined with fresh eyes, as if the answers might have been hiding in plain sight all along. And through it all, one question hung heavy, unspoken but impossible to ignore. If this was the truth, why now, after all these years? And if it wasn't, what did the caller gain by reopening a wound that never healed? The cold case had cracked, yes, but cracks don't always mean collapse. Sometimes they only let you see how deep the damage really goes, how much is still hidden beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to emerge. The name the caller gave was not unfamiliar, but it arrived with a different weight this time, heavier, sharper, like a door being unlocked from the inside, and investigators felt the room tilt as they searched old databases and saw the history light up again. The man had been questioned once, briefly, in the early 90s, a footnote in a long list of maybes, dismissed because his alibi had seemed solid enough and because the city had too many louder suspects demanding attention. He had vanished from the file the way so many had, swallowed by time, by paperwork, by the assumption that if he mattered, he would have surfaced again. Now his voice had dragged him back into the light, and the first question was not whether he was guilty, but why he had chosen this moment to speak. Detectives traced the call to a payphone that no longer existed, a relic torn out years ago when the city decided it didn't need places to hide anymore. Surveillance cameras in the area showed nothing useful, just shadows and rain, umbrellas bobbing like punctuation marks in a sentence no one could finish. The man had planned that much carefully, choosing anonymity over spectacle, confession without capture. It was a move that suggested control, not panic, someone setting the terms rather than surrendering to them. They pulled his old file, then compared to others, and began to read it like it was new. Back then, he'd been cooperative, almost eager, answering questions with a calm that bordered on indifference. He'd said he barely knew the victim, that they'd crossed paths through mutual friends, that the night in question he'd been somewhere else entirely. Two people had backed him up, casual acquaintances who couldn't remember exact times but remembered enough to sound convincing. In 1991, that had been enough. Now, 30 years later, those witnesses were gone. One dead, the other untraceable, their words frozen in ink, immune to cross-examination. The confession replayed on a tape recorder in a small interview room, the sound slightly warped, the pauses louder than the words. He described entering the apartment willingly, no forced entry, no struggle at the door. He spoke of an argument that escalated, voices raised but not screaming, a tension that felt inevitable in hindsight. He claimed the violence was sudden, unplanned, a moment that spun out of control, and yet the forensic details didn't quite agree. The injuries suggested intention, restraint, a hand that knew exactly how much force to apply. Investigators circled those inconsistencies, red pen bleeding into the margins of old reports. They went back to the physical evidence, what little there was. The glass with the lipstick smudge had been tested years ago, the DNA degraded, inconclusive. Now, with newer methods, they tried again, coaxing fragments into profiles that might speak. The jacket, once dismissed as belonging to a neighbor or a friend, was re-examined, fibers compared, seams checked for hidden traces. It yielded nothing definitive, just the faint sense that it had been handled, worn by someone who'd left without it, or perhaps planted it to confuse the story. The chemical smell noted at the scene took on new significance, but lab reports from the time were vague, limited by the technology of the era. As investigators dug, the city outside continued to react to the headlines, talk radio buzzing with theories, social media resurrecting names that hadn't been spoken aloud in decades. Armchair detectives dissected the confession, some calling it a breakthrough, others a distraction. The victim's family watched cautiously, aware that public excitement often burned hot and then vanished, leaving them alone with the same questions they'd always had. They wanted justice, but they'd learned the cost of hope. The man himself remained elusive, not turning himself in, not responding to attempts to locate him through old addresses and employment records. He had lived quietly, it seemed, no arrests, no obvious signs of a life unraveling under guilt. Friends described him as reserved, disciplined, the kind of person who kept his past locked away. That made the confession stranger, not less. People who carry secrets that long rarely release them without a reason, and investigators searched for one, combing through his recent history for triggers: illness, financial trouble, the death of someone close. Nothing obvious surfaced, which only deepened the unease. There were other angles, too, threads that had been abandoned years earlier and now demanded attention again. A coworker who'd clashed with the victim days before the death. A neighbor who'd moved out abruptly after the police first came knocking. An anonymous tip about a second person in the apartment that night, someone whose presence had never been confirmed. Each lead pulled at the edges of the confession, threatening to unravel it or weave it into something larger. The case refused to settle into a single shape. Late nights at the precinct blurred together, coffee cups piling up as detectives argued over theories, over whether the confession was an attempt to control the narrative before someone else did. They debated the possibility of false memory, of a story shaped by years of headlines and rumors, of a man inserting himself into a crime he hadn't committed for reasons that made sense only to him. But then there were details he shouldn't have known, small, specific things that hadn't been publicized, details that sent a chill through the room when they surfaced. One detective, younger, less burdened by the ghosts of past failures, suggested a simple explanation: guilt. Maybe the man had carried it as long as he could and finally cracked. The older detectives weren't convinced. They'd seen guilt behave differently, erupt in messy ways, not in controlled midnight phone calls. This felt calculated, almost strategic, and that implied something else at play. As days turned into weeks, pressure mounted. Prosecutors wanted more before they'd consider charges. The media wanted updates. The family wanted answers. And the confession sat at the center of it all, a fragile thing, powerful but unproven. Investigators tracked down anyone who'd crossed paths with the man in the early 90s, piecing together a map of relationships that looked ordinary on the surface, but hinted at deeper tensions underneath. There were rumors of jealousy, of debts, of a falling out that had never been fully explored. None of it rose to the level of certainty, but it added texture to a story that had once been flat. Then there was the question of timing again, the one that refused to go away. Why speak now, when the statute of limitations on certain charges had shifted, when technology threatened to expose things once thought safe? Some suspected he was trying to get ahead of something, a new test, a new witness, a discovery he believed was imminent. Others thought it was an attempt to rewrite history, to frame the crime as an accident, a momentary lapse, before someone else told a harsher version. The city watched, breath held, as the cold case inched forward, no longer frozen but far from resolved. Every development seemed to bring clarity and confusion in equal measure, the truth shimmering just out of reach. Investigators knew they were walking a narrow line, that one wrong assumption could send them chasing shadows for another decade. The confession had stunned them, yes, but it had also opened a door to a darker, more complicated story, one where answers came with a price, and the past refused to stay quiet. And somewhere, out there in the city, the man who'd called at 2:17 a.m. waited, silent again, watching the ripples spread, knowing that whether he had told the whole truth or only a carefully chosen piece of it, the cold case was no longer asleep, and it was moving closer, slowly, relentlessly, towards something that looked like justice, or maybe something far more unsettling. The first real fracture in the confession appeared quietly, buried in a detail so small it almost slipped past, a single sentence about the layout of the apartment that didn't match the photographs taken in 1991. The caller had described a narrow kitchen opening directly into the living room, a clear line of sight from the door to the window, but the crime scene photos showed a partial wall that blocked that view, a renovation done years later, not before. It was the kind of mistake someone who hadn't been there would make, the kind of slip that turns confidence into suspicion, and investigators felt the ground shift again beneath their feet. If he hadn't stood in that room, how did he know the rest? The details that had never been public, the timing, the words spoken before everything went wrong. They went back to the building's records, tracking renovations like archaeologists, peeling back layers of drywall and permits to reconstruct the space as it had been. The partial wall had been added in the late 90s, long after the murder, which meant the caller's mental image came from somewhere else, from later visits, from conversations, from imagination shaped by rumor. That didn't erase the confession, but it complicated it, turning certainty into a spectrum instead of a point. Prosecutors were warned, quietly, that the case was not as clean as the headlines suggested. At the same time, new forensic results trickled in, slow and frustrating, each one carrying the promise of clarity and the threat of disappointment. The lipstick on the glass yielded a partial profile at last, faint but usable, not a match to the victim, not a match to anyone in the old suspect pool, and not a match to the man who had confessed. It belonged to someone else, someone who had been in that apartment close to the time of death, someone whose presence had never been explained. The result landed like a dropped plate in the precinct, sharp and impossible to ignore. Investigators revisited old interviews with that new knowledge, listening for voices they'd dismissed, for statements that sounded different now. A friend who'd mentioned a guest earlier that evening but couldn't remember a name. A neighbor who'd thought they heard 2 sets of footsteps leaving, not one. At the time, those details had been chalked up to confusion, memory warped by shock. Now they looked like pieces of a puzzle that had been misread, or perhaps deliberately misfiled. Pressure mounted from another direction when a journalist dug up an old rumor and pushed it into the light, a whisper that the victim had been involved in something risky, something that brought dangerous people into their orbit. The rumor had never been substantiated, but it had circulated quietly back then, enough to make detectives uneasy. They'd avoided it, lacking proof, unwilling to smear the dead. Now, with the case reopened, it demanded attention again. Investigators followed the thread into a world of backroom deals, small-time hustles, and favors owed, a side of the city that thrived in the shadows of the early 90s. As they dug deeper, the timeline of the night grew more crowded, less simple. Phone records showed a call made from the victim's apartment hours before the estimated time of death, a call that had never been identified. It wasn't the man who'd confessed. It wasn't anyone in the immediate circle. The number led to a pay phone near a club that had since closed, another dead end that felt deliberate, as if the city itself had conspired to erase the path. Detectives tried to locate the caller again, using every trick they knew, tracing financial records, monitoring addresses associated with his name, hoping he'd slip up. He didn't. It was as if he'd stepped out of time after that call, leaving behind only his voice and a story that no longer fit neatly. Some wondered if he was watching, adjusting his silence based on what the police discovered, ready to speak again if the narrative threatened to drift too far from his version. The victim's family was brought in for an update, the room heavy with decades of restrained grief. They listened as investigators explained the new findings, the DNA that didn't match, the inconsistencies in the confession. There was no celebration, no relief, just a familiar tightening of the chest, the sense that closure had been dangled and pulled away once more. They asked the question they'd learned to ask carefully. Were they any closer to the truth? The answer was honest but unsatisfying.
Closer, yes. Certain, no.
Inside the precinct, the mood shifted from cautious optimism to something darker, more complex. This was no longer a story of a guilty conscience finally speaking, but a maze of overlapping narratives, each one vying to be believed. The confession might have been an attempt to steer the investigation away from someone else, or to minimize a role that was larger than admitted. It might have been a confession to being present, not to committing the act. Or it might have been a lie layered over fragments of truth, designed to muddy waters that were finally starting to clear. One veteran detective pulled a box from the archives, a box that hadn't been opened in years, labeled simply with a case number and a date. Inside were notes taken by a colleague long retired, scribbles in the margins that hinted at suspicions never pursued. A name appeared more than once, circled, underlined, then crossed out. That person had never been formally investigated, dismissed early as irrelevant. Now, with fresh eyes, the name looked different, less random, more deliberate. When detectives ran it through modern databases, the result made them pause. The person was alive, local, and had a history that intersected with both the victim and the confessor in ways no one had noticed before. As night fell again over New York, the city glowing with the same restless energy it had in 1991, investigators felt the weight of the case pressing down harder. The cold case had cracked open, but instead of a single answer spilling out, a dozen new questions crowded in. The confession that had stunned everyone now looked like the first move in a much longer game, one where truth, guilt, and manipulation blurred together until they were nearly indistinguishable. And somewhere between the old photographs and the new DNA results, between a voice on a tape and a name circled in red ink decades ago, the shape of the night began to change, not toward resolution, but toward something more unsettling, the realization that the murder might never have been the work of a single hand, and that the silence that followed had been carefully maintained by more than one person who understood exactly how easy it was for a city to forget. The circled name refused to stay quiet, no matter how many times investigators tried to approach it cautiously, because once you notice a pattern you can't unsee it, and this one threaded through the case like a vein under skin. The man had been close enough to know the victim's habits, distant enough to avoid early suspicion, present in the background of several witness statements, without ever stepping into the foreground. In 1991, he'd been a blur, just another face in a city full of faces. Now, with decades of context layered on top, his outline sharpened, and detectives realized how neatly he'd slipped past them the first time. They tracked him down to a modest apartment in Queens, a life built on routine and invisibility, the kind that doesn't draw attention. He answered the door himself, older, heavier, eyes clouded but alert, the look of someone who has spent years expecting a knock that never came. He agreed to talk, perhaps too quickly, perhaps relieved that the waiting was finally over. His story flowed easily at first, a polished narrative that matched what he'd told police years ago, but when pressed on specifics, it began to wobble, timelines bending just enough to raise eyebrows. He denied being at the apartment that night, denied seeing the victim in the days leading up to the death, denied knowing the man who'd confessed beyond a passing acquaintance. But small details betrayed him. A memory of a song playing on the radio that night that hadn't been released yet, a description of the building's stairwell that matched its old layout too precisely to be guessed. Investigators exchanged glances, the unspoken agreement that something here didn't add up. At the same time, forensic analysts worked to push the partial DNA profile further, comparing it against newly expanded databases, hoping for a hit. Days passed with no match, then weeks, then a notification that stopped everyone cold. The profile showed a familial link, not a direct match, but close enough to suggest a relative, someone connected by blood. It was a fragile lead, easy to misinterpret, but it pointed in a direction that investigators couldn't ignore. The city, it seemed, had not just forgotten this case, it had buried it under generations. As detectives followed that trail, they uncovered a network of relationships that reframed the night entirely. The victim hadn't been alone as often as believed. There were meetings unrecorded, visits that left no paper trail, conversations conducted in places where no one asked questions. The apartment, once thought of as a private space, began to look like a crossroads, a place where tensions converged and decisions were made quietly. The confession, in that light, felt less like an ending and more like a distraction, a way to draw focus away from something messier. Media coverage intensified as leaks found their way into print, headlines shifting from certainty to doubt, from cold case cracked to new questions emerge. Talk shows speculated about accomplices, cover-ups, and the possibility that justice had been delayed not by incompetence, but by design. The community reacted with anger now, not relief, the sense that they'd been misled twice, once in 1991, and again now. The victim's family watched the narrative twist and turn, exhausted by the constant recalibration of hope. Investigators returned to the man who'd confessed, this time in person, after finally locating him through a relative's address. He looked smaller than his voice had suggested, a man worn down by time, hands trembling slightly as he spoke. Confronted with the inconsistencies, with the DNA that didn't match, with the emerging picture of a more crowded crime scene, he faltered. He admitted he hadn't told the whole story, that he'd been there, yes, but not alone, and that fear had kept him silent for years. Fear of whom, he wouldn't say at first. When he did, the name matched the one circled in red ink decades ago. The room went quiet as the implication settled in. Two men, possibly more, bound by a moment that had spiraled out of control, bound by silence that had hardened into a pact. The confession had been an attempt to break that pact without fully shattering it, to test how much the past could be exposed without bringing everything down. It was a dangerous game, and everyone in the room knew it. As the investigation widened, old wounds reopened across the city. Other cases resurfacing in whispers, connections suggested but never proven. Detectives began to wonder how many stories like this one lay dormant, waiting for the right pressure to bring them back. The sense of isolation that had once defined the case dissolved, replaced by the unsettling idea that this murder was part of a larger, uglier pattern. Night after night, investigators worked through stacks of files, cross-referencing names, dates, places, the walls of the squad room slowly filling with photos and strings like a map of obsession. Each new link made the story more complex, less tidy, the truth receding even as it felt closer than ever. The city outside seemed to lean in, listening, aware that something long hidden was beginning to stir. By the time the sun rose again, casting pale light over the skyline, the case had transformed completely. What had once been a single death in a quiet apartment now looked like a convergence of secrets, loyalties, and fear, a cold case that refused to be solved cleanly. The confession that had stunned investigators was no longer the center of the story, just one voice in a chorus that had been silent for far too long, and as the chorus began to swell, there was a growing sense that when it finally reached its climax, the truth would be louder, darker, and far more devastating than anyone had expected. The deeper investigators pushed, the more resistance they felt, not from the evidence itself, but from the spaces between it, the gaps where answers should have been and weren't, the quiet places where people had learned to look away. The name that kept resurfacing led them into a tight circle of old connections, favors traded in the early 90s when the city's edges were rougher and accountability was negotiable. These were not kingpins or masterminds, just people who understood how to survive in the margins, how to keep their mouths shut when silence was safer than truth. Records showed that the man circled in red had changed jobs frequently after 1991, never staying long enough to draw attention, always leaving before questions could form. He'd moved apartments just often enough to stay ahead of patterns, his life a series of small resets that looked normal on paper, but in context felt intentional. When detectives laid out his timeline alongside the victim's final weeks, overlaps appeared, casual at first, then undeniable. They'd been in the same places on the same nights, more than coincidence could explain. The familial DNA link narrowed further as analysts cross-checked relatives, ruling out siblings and cousins one by one until only a handful remained. One of them lived within walking distance of the crime scene in 1991, a fact that had never stood out before because no one had been looking for it. When detectives knocked on that door, they were met with confusion, then fear, then anger, the kind of reaction that speaks louder than words. The relative denied everything, but their hands shook as they spoke, and their story shifted subtly each time it was retold. Investigators began to suspect that the apartment that night had been more crowded than anyone had admitted, that what started as a meeting had escalated into something chaotic, something no one involved had planned for. In that version of events, the death wasn't the result of a single act but of a series of decisions, each one small, each one compounding the last. Responsibility blurred, shared and diluted among those present, making it easier for everyone to stay silent. The man who had confessed was brought back in for another interview, this time with the weight of new evidence pressing down on him. He spoke more freely now, exhaustion cracking the careful control he'd maintained. He described the atmosphere that night as tense, charged, a sense that something was about to break. He admitted to arguing, to pushing, to words said in anger that couldn't be taken back. He stopped short of admitting to the fatal act itself, insisting someone else had gone too far, that he'd tried to intervene, that panic had taken over when the victim stopped moving. Detectives listened, aware that this might be the closest they'd come to the truth, even if it wasn't complete. They pressed him on the others present, on who had left first, on who had suggested calling for help, and who had shut that idea down. His answers came slowly, each one extracted like a confession within a confession. He described a moment of silence after the violence, a shared understanding that whatever had just happened could never be undone, only hidden. Outside the precinct, the story continued to shift in the public eye. The idea of a lone killer gave way to speculation about accomplices, about a cover-up that had lasted decades. Some in the community began to ask uncomfortable questions about how many people had known and chosen not to speak, about whether silence had been rewarded, directly or indirectly. The victim's family watched the narrative expand, the grief they'd carried alone now echoed by a broader sense of betrayal. Investigators dug into old financial records, looking for transactions that might suggest payoff or pressure, and found hints but no smoking gun. Small sums exchanged, debts forgiven, favors returned, the kind of transactions that are easy to explain away individually but harder to ignore in aggregate. It painted a picture of a network bound not by conspiracy, but by mutual self-interest, by the understanding that everyone stood to lose if the truth came out. As the weeks passed, fatigue set in, the kind that comes from chasing a story that keeps changing shape. Detectives argued over strategy, over whether to push for charges with what they had or keep digging in the hope of something more definitive. Prosecutors warned that without a clear narrative and solid evidence tying each person to a specific act, the case could collapse under its own weight. The cold case had warmed, but it was still slippery, still dangerous to handle. One night, long after most of the building had gone quiet, a detective sat alone with the case file, reading the original reports again, not for facts but for tone, for what had been left unsaid. He noticed a pattern in the early interviews, a hesitance around certain names, a reluctance to press too hard. Whether it had been fear, fatigue, or the sheer volume of crime at the time, something had stopped the investigation from going further. That hesitation had created the space in which the truth had hidden all these years. As dawn approached, the realization settled in that solving this case would not be about a single revelation or a dramatic arrest, but about untangling decades of silence, about convincing people that the cost of speaking now was lower than the cost of continuing to hide. The confession that had reignited everything was no longer the focus. It was a spark that had lit a much larger fire. And in the glow of that fire, investigators could see the outlines of a truth that was messier, darker, and far more collective than they'd ever imagined, a truth that implicated not just one person, but a moment, a network, and a city that had been all too willing to let a cold case fade into the background, as long as it stayed quiet. The silence began to fracture under pressure, not all at once, not dramatically, but in small, uneven breaks, the way ice gives way before it shatters. It started with a call from someone who refused to give their name, a voice rough with age and fear, asking what would happen if they told the truth now. Detectives didn't promise anything they couldn't deliver. They'd learned that lesson long ago. They only said the truth mattered, that time had changed things, that the weight of carrying it might finally be heavier than the consequences of letting it go. That voice belonged to a peripheral figure, someone who hadn't been in the apartment but had been close enough to feel the tremor when everything went wrong. He described a frantic knock late that night, a request for help that was half-formed and quickly withdrawn, a look on a familiar face that told him not to ask questions. He hadn't seen the body, hadn't heard the argument, but he'd known something bad had happened. He'd chosen silence, he said, because in 1991 silence was survival. Saying that out loud, 3 decades later, seemed to surprise him. His account didn't solve the case, but it filled a negative space, confirmed the presence of more than one person, confirmed panic, confirmed a decision made collectively to do nothing. Investigators added his statement to the growing mosaic, aware that each new piece made the picture clearer and harder to deny. They began to understand how the night had unfolded less like a crime of passion and more like a chain reaction, each person responding to the last, momentum carrying them all forward until stopping felt impossible. With that in mind, detectives re-examined the medical examiner's report yet again, this time reading it not as a verdict but as a sequence. The injuries suggested multiple points of contact, not necessarily multiple attackers at once, but hands overlapping in time, restraint followed by force, intervention that came too late or made things worse. It was the kind of nuance that had been easy to miss when the case was fresh and the pressure to move on was immense. The man who had confessed was confronted with this new statement. He didn't deny it. Instead, he closed his eyes, as if bracing for something he'd known was coming. He admitted that after the violence, there had been confusion, arguments about what to do next, someone insisting they call for help, someone else warning that it would ruin all of them. He described standing in that apartment, listening to the city outside continue as if nothing had changed, and realizing how easy it would be to disappear into it. Investigators pressed him on the aftermath, on how the story had been managed in the days that followed. He spoke of phone calls made and not returned, of quiet assurances that things would blow over, of an understanding that if everyone stuck to the same vague version of events, the truth would dissolve. No single mastermind, no formal agreement, just a shared instinct to protect themselves. It was a strategy born of fear and reinforced by time. As more statements came in, the pattern repeated. People remembered fragments, moments they dismissed or suppressed, details that took on new meaning now. A ride given at an odd hour. A jacket disposed of instead of returned. A conversation cut short when someone entered the room. None of it was enough on its own, but together it told a story of complicity, of a community that had closed ranks without ever saying so explicitly. The city reacted in waves. For some, the revelations confirmed what they'd always suspected, that the truth had been there all along, just ignored. For others, it was unsettling to realize how easily ordinary people could become part of something terrible through inaction. The victim's family listened to each new detail with a mixture of relief and anguish, relief that the silence was finally breaking, anguish at how preventable the outcome now seemed. Inside the investigation, a sense of urgency replaced the earlier caution. Detectives knew they were running out of time, not just because of public pressure, but because memories were fragile, witnesses aging. They pushed harder, scheduling interviews back-to-back, comparing notes late into the night, looking for the moment where the narratives converged. They weren't chasing a confession anymore. They were chasing coherence, a version of events that could withstand scrutiny. Prosecutors began to sketch out possible charges, weighing individual actions against collective responsibility. It was a legal minefield, the kind of case that could collapse if presented clumsily. They needed clarity on who did what, when, and why, but the truth resisted that kind of clean division. The night had been chaotic, roles overlapping, intentions shifting. It was a reminder that reality rarely conforms to the structure of a courtroom. As the case edged closer to something resembling resolution, the mood grew heavier. There was no triumph in this work, no sense of victory, only the slow recognition of how much damage had been done by a single night and the decades of silence that followed. The cold case was no longer just about a death. It was about the cost of looking away, about the way fear can bind people together long after the immediate danger has passed. And still, one question lingered, the most uncomfortable one of all. At what point does silence become an act in itself? As investigators prepared for the next phase, for confrontations that would force the remaining secrets into the open, they knew the answer would not be simple. The truth, when it finally emerged fully, would not offer clean heroes or villains, only a mirror held up to a moment when doing nothing had felt like the safest choice, and the consequences of that choice had echoed through a city for more than 30 years. The first arrest came quietly, without sirens or cameras. A man let out of his apartment at dawn while the city was still deciding whether to wake up. It wasn't the confession everyone had been waiting for, not the face splashed across headlines months earlier, but someone lower in the hierarchy of guilt, someone whose role had always been minimized. Investigators chose him deliberately, knowing pressure travels fastest when it moves uphill. The charge wasn't murder. Not yet, but obstruction, conspiracy, the legal language of silence finally catching up to him. He broke faster than expected. In a small interview room, under fluorescent lights that flattened everything, he talked about that night in pieces, starting in the middle, as if the beginning was too heavy to touch. He admitted being there, admitted seeing the victim still alive when he left, admitted knowing help should have been called, and choosing not to. He described the atmosphere as suffocating, everyone talking at once, fear passing between them like a current. No one wanted to be the first to say the words out loud, that someone might already be dead. His statement reframed the timeline again. The victim hadn't died immediately, not in the instant of violence everyone had clung to. There had been minutes, maybe longer, a window where intervention could have changed everything. That revelation hit the investigation like a punch to the chest, turning negligence into something darker, closer to intent. It wasn't just what had been done, but what hadn't. When investigators confronted the others with this version, reactions varied. One went silent entirely, lawyered up without a word. Another lashed out, accusing everyone else of exaggeration, of rewriting history to save themselves. The man who had confessed earlier looked hollow now, his attempt to control the narrative unraveling in front of him. He admitted more, details spilling out as if he'd been holding them back physically, afraid of what would happen if he let them go. He described the moment he realized the victim wasn't responding, the way the room seemed to shrink, the sound of the radiator suddenly too loud. He talked about someone suggesting they check for a pulse, someone else saying it was pointless, that it was already over. He didn't say who made the final call to leave, only that when he stepped into the hallway, his legs felt weak and the city outside felt impossibly normal. For the first time, investigators had something close to a shared account, overlapping enough to form a spine the case could stand on. It still wasn't perfect. Memories contradicted each other on key points, and self-interest colored every statement. But the broad strokes aligned: multiple people present, escalating conflict, a critical delay, and a collective decision to walk away. The legal implications rippled outward immediately. Prosecutors recalculated strategies, considering charges that reflected not just the act of violence, but the failure to act afterward. Manslaughter, criminally negligent homicide, conspiracy. Each carried its own burden of proof, its own risks. This was no longer about pinning everything on one person. It was about convincing a jury that responsibility could be shared without being diluted. The media seized on the idea of delayed death, the possibility that the victim might have survived. Headlines sharpened, language turning harsher, public sympathy shifting toward anger. Callers flooded radio shows, asking how many people had known and stayed silent, how many had passed the apartment that night unaware that someone inside was dying. The case became a referendum on bystander behavior, on the thin line between fear and cruelty. The victim's family heard the details in a private meeting before they reached the press. The room was quiet as investigators spoke, careful but honest. When they finished, there were no questions at first, just the sound of someone breathing too fast, holding back something that couldn't be contained. Grief changed shape in that moment, mixing with rage, the knowledge that help had been possible turning old pain into something sharper, harder to carry. As arrests loomed, investigators felt the atmosphere tighten. Cooperation slowed, lawyers intervened, statements grew more guarded. The easy days of revelation were over. Now every word mattered, every inconsistency scrutinized. The case file thickened again, not with speculation but with sworn testimony, timelines built down to the minute, phone records layered over movement logs like transparencies. One night, as detectives reviewed surveillance footage from a nearby street, enhanced with modern tools, they noticed something that had been missed before. Two figures exiting the building close together, one pausing briefly as if waiting, the other turning back for a moment before disappearing into the darkness. The timestamp aligned with the new timeline, the window when the victim might still have been alive. It wasn't definitive, but it was haunting, a visual echo of choices made and unmade. By the end of the week, the case had crossed a threshold. It was no longer just reopened. It was alive, moving through the system with momentum that felt both necessary and dangerous. The cold case that had once been a whisper was now a roar, and everyone involved understood that the next steps would be the most consequential. Because once silence breaks, it doesn't do so gently. It shatters, sending fragments in every direction, cutting through stories people have told themselves for decades. And as investigators prepared to bring those fragments together in a way that could stand in court, they knew the hardest part was still ahead. Not proving that something terrible had happened, but proving that doing nothing had been a choice, and that choice had changed everything. The second arrest didn't come with surprise, only inevitability, the sense that gravity had finally finished its work. This time it was the name that had been circled in red decades earlier, the one that kept surfacing no matter how the story shifted. He was taken in midday, at work, escorted past coworkers who stared without understanding, the ordinary humiliation of accountability unfolding in real time. He said nothing as he was led away, jaw set, eyes forward. A man who had practiced this moment in his head for years and still wasn't ready for it. In the interview room, the silence stretched long enough to feel intentional. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady, almost clinical, as if distance could still protect him. He denied the violence, denied laying hands on the victim, admitted only to being present, to witnessing something that went wrong faster than anyone expected. He positioned himself as the rational one, the voice urging calm, the person who wanted to leave and let things cool down. It was a familiar posture, one investigators had seen many times before, responsibility reframed as proximity without agency. They didn't argue at first. They laid out the timeline instead, minute by minute, phone records clicking into place like teeth in a zipper. They showed him the surveillance footage, grainy but clear enough, the two figures exiting the building, the pause, the turn back. They played him the statement from the first arrest, then the second, voices overlapping in their contradictions, but aligning on one crucial point. He had been there when the decision was made not to call for help. That was when his composure cracked, not dramatically, but in a subtle tightening around the eyes, a breath taken too sharply. He pushed back, accusing others of lying to save themselves, of exaggerating the delay, of projecting guilt onto him because he'd always been the easiest target. He claimed the victim was already gone when he left, that calling anyone would have changed nothing. Investigators let the words hang, then introduced the medical examiner's revised analysis, the possibility of survivability within a narrow window. The room shifted. The story he'd rehearsed no longer fit. Outside, the case continued to metastasize, reaching into places no one had anticipated. Old associates of the group came forward with fragments of memory, comments made in passing years ago that suddenly sounded like admissions. A joke that wasn't really a joke. A warning not to talk about that night. Each fragment added weight, making denial harder to maintain. The narrative of collective silence hardened into something that looked a lot like coordination, even if no one had ever said the words out loud. Prosecutors began drafting charges in earnest, language sharpened by months of work, careful to reflect individual actions within a shared outcome. They knew the defense would argue ambiguity, that memory was unreliable, that 30 years had distorted everything. To counter that, they leaned into convergence, the way independent accounts had begun to mirror each other without rehearsing. The truth, they argued, had emerged not because one person decided to tell it, but because too many people could no longer keep it straight while lying. The man who had confessed first watched all of this from a holding cell, the irony not lost on him. His attempt to ease his conscience had accelerated a process he could no longer control. In another interview, he admitted as much, saying he'd hoped to take on the worst of it himself, to contain the damage. He spoke of fear again, but this time it sounded smaller, less noble, fear of being the last one left holding the secret when everyone else had moved on. Investigators noted the shift. Confessions change when their purpose fails. As court dates loomed, the city's attention sharpened. This was no longer a mystery story. It was a reckoning. Editorials debated the ethics of delayed justice, the fairness of prosecuting actions clouded by time. Some argued that everyone involved had already served a sentence of sorts, living under the shadow of what they'd done. Others countered that the victim had served the only sentence that mattered, and silence had been an accomplice. The victim's family prepared for something they'd never truly believed would come, the possibility of hearing the full story told aloud, under oath. They met with prosecutors, absorbing legal language that felt inadequate to describe their loss. They asked not for vengeance, but for acknowledgement, for the truth to exist somewhere solid, undeniable. Investigators promised only what they could deliver, that the silence would not be allowed to stand as the final word. In the final days before the arraignments, tension crept into every corner of the investigation. Witnesses were coached and cautioned. Evidence was reviewed again and again, every weakness interrogated. The case had grown too big to fail quietly. If it collapsed now, it would take more than one reputation with it. Everyone involved felt the stakes, the sense that this was about more than one death, more than one night. And as the cold case edged toward a courtroom, something else became clear, something that had been there all along but was only now impossible to ignore. The mystery had never been whether the truth existed. It had been whether anyone would choose it when silence was easier. The arrests had answered that question imperfectly, belatedly, but enough to change the shape of the past. Because once the truth begins to surface, it doesn't rise cleanly. It drags everything with it: excuses, rationalizations, the small lies told to make bigger ones livable. And as Part 8 of this story closed, with charges drafted and silence finally cracking under its own weight, the city braced itself for what would happen when all of it was spoken out loud, in a room where there would be no place left to hide. The courtroom felt smaller than anyone expected, compressed by anticipation, by decades of waiting distilled into a single space where every sound seemed amplified. When proceedings began, there was no dramatic confession, no cinematic breakdown, just the steady rhythm of testimony, the slow, relentless assembly of a night that had resisted reconstruction for 30 years. Prosecutors started at the edges, careful, methodical, establishing context before blame, knowing that rushing the truth now would only fracture it again. Witnesses took the stand one by one, voices trembling or flat with practiced detachment, each recounting their version of events. The overlap was impossible to ignore. Different words, same moments. Raised voices. A sudden escalation. The pause that followed, heavy and uncertain. The decision not to call for help. Defense attorneys attacked memory, attacked motive, suggested contamination by media coverage and mutual influence. But the witnesses hadn't rehearsed together, and the imperfections in their stories made them feel real. Lies tend to be smooth. These were jagged. The medical examiner's testimony landed hardest. Charts and timelines replaced emotion, but the implication was devastating. Within a narrow window, intervention could have altered the outcome. Oxygen deprivation. A chance, small but real. The defense pushed back, emphasizing uncertainty, probability rather than certainty. The prosecutor didn't argue the science. He argued the choice. When faced with uncertainty, they had chosen themselves. As the man who had first confessed listened, his face betrayed something close to regret, not just for the death, but for the years spent pretending it belonged to someone else. When he took the stand, he spoke quietly, acknowledging fear, acknowledging silence, acknowledging that he had hoped time would erase what he could not face. His words didn't absolve him. They didn't need to. They confirmed what the evidence had already suggested. The crime was not a moment, but a process. The circled name followed, defense sharper, posture rigid. He denied intent, denied responsibility, framed his actions as passive, unavoidable. Prosecutors dismantled that framing patiently, introducing messages, witness statements, movements that contradicted his version. They didn't accuse him of delivering the fatal act. They accused him of standing still when motion mattered. The distinction hung in the air, uncomfortable and damning. Outside the courtroom, the city watched in fragments, headlines reducing complexity to verdicts in waiting. Inside, the jury absorbed it all, faces unreadable, notebooks filling with arrows and underlines. This was not a case built on spectacle. It was built on accumulation, on the weight of small decisions stacked so high they could no longer be ignored. When closing arguments came, they avoided theatrics. The prosecutor spoke of responsibility as something shared, not diluted by numbers, but intensified by them. He reminded the jury that laws exist not just to punish violence, but to define obligation, the duty owed to another human being when harm is possible. The defense responded with doubt, with the danger of judging the past through a modern lens, with the insistence that certainty was impossible. They were right about one thing: certainty was impossible. But the law did not require perfection, only belief beyond reasonable doubt. Deliberations stretched on, hours turning into a day, then another. The victim's family waited, hands clasped, bracing for an outcome that would never restore what had been lost. Investigators waited too, aware that whatever the verdict, the case had already changed the city's understanding of itself. Silence had been exposed not as absence, but as action. When the jury returned, the room stilled. The foreperson's voice was steady as the first verdict was read.
Guilty.
Then another.
Guilty.
Not all charges stuck. Some fell away, victims of time and ambiguity. But enough remained. Enough to mark the night as no longer unresolved, no longer hidden behind the phrase cold case. Sentencing would come later. Appeals would follow. The story was not finished in the way stories rarely are. But something fundamental had shifted. The truth, incomplete and imperfect, now existed in the open, recorded, acknowledged. The silence that had protected so many for so long had finally failed. As the defendants were led away, the city outside continued as it always had, indifferent and alive. But beneath that rhythm, something had changed. A lesson had surfaced, uncomfortable and unavoidable, about how easily harm can be compounded by fear, about how the decision to do nothing can echo louder than violence itself. And as the courtroom emptied, leaving behind only the echo of footsteps and the weight of what had been said, the cold case that began in 1991 settled into a new form. No longer a mystery of who, but a reckoning of why and how many people it takes to let a life slip away without lifting a phone, without opening a door, without choosing to act when action might have mattered most. The sentencing phase stripped away whatever distance the courtroom drama had offered, replacing it with something heavier, more intimate, a reckoning that no verdict could soften. This was where the story stopped being abstract, where years and intentions condensed into numbers, into time that would now be measured in cells and calendars. The judge listened without expression as prosecutors spoke of accountability delayed but not denied, of a life reduced to evidence and then slowly rebuilt through testimony. The defense argued mitigation, fear, context, the chaos of a city in 1991, but the words felt thinner now, worn down by repetition. One by one, the defendants were invited to speak. Some declined, silence finally choosing them. Others offered statements carefully shaped by counsel, apologies that acknowledged pain without fully embracing blame. The man who had confessed first spoke last. His voice shook as he described the weight of carrying the secret, the way it had seeped into every decision he'd made since. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He said he understood if none was given. In the room, no one moved. The victim's family stood next. Their words cut through legal language with brutal clarity. They spoke of birthdays missed, of a chair that stayed empty year after year, of the strange cruelty of learning that help might have been possible. They didn't raise their voices. They didn't need to. The truth they carried had been tempered by time into something unbreakable. When they finished, the courtroom felt altered, as if the air itself had absorbed what had been said. The sentences reflected compromise, the law's attempt to translate moral weight into measurable consequence. Years for some, less for others. No one walked free. No one received what the victim had lost. As each number was read, reactions flickered across faces: relief, disbelief, resignation. Justice, if that's what it was, arrived unevenly, constrained by statutes and proof, by what could be demonstrated beyond doubt rather than what was known in the gut. Outside, reactions were divided. Some called the outcome overdue. Others questioned whether punishment, after so long, served any purpose beyond symbolism. The city argued with itself, as it always does, trying to decide what justice should look like when time has blurred the edges. Editorials filled columns. Commentators debated deterrence, closure, the meaning of accountability when the past refuses to stay past. For investigators, there was no celebration. They returned to their desks, to other files, other names waiting for attention. This case had consumed years of their lives, reopening wounds they hadn't known were still raw. Now it was over, at least in the way cases are ever truly over. The boxes would be archived again, heavier this time, filled with answers that had arrived too late to change the outcome but not too late to matter. The building where it all began stood unchanged, its hallways repainted, its history invisible to those who passed through daily. New tenants came and went, unaware of the night that still echoed faintly in the walls. For the neighborhood, the case became a story told occasionally, a reminder that the city's memory is selective, that some truths only surface when someone decides the silence has cost too much. Appeals were filed, as expected, language shifting once more from testimony to technicality. The legal battle would continue in quieter rooms, far from cameras, but the core of the story had been spoken aloud and recorded. It could no longer be erased or ignored. The cold case had been transformed, not into a clean narrative of guilt and punishment, but into something messier and more honest. What lingered most was not the image of handcuffs or verdicts, but the simplicity of the turning point, the moment when someone could have picked up a phone and didn't. That absence haunted the proceedings more than any act of violence. It was the negative space around the crime, the silence that had allowed everything else to unfold. As the city moved on, as it always does, the case receded from headlines, replaced by newer shocks, newer tragedies. But for those who had lived inside it, who had listened to the echoes of that night and followed them across decades, the story never fully ended. It became the reference point, a quiet warning, a reminder etched into memory. Because the most unsettling truth to emerge from this cold case was not that evil had gone unpunished for so long, but that it had needed to hide very hard. It had relied on fear, on hesitation, on the belief that someone else would act. And when no one did, it waited, patient and silent, until time itself was no longer enough to keep it buried. Long after the sentences were handed down and the courtroom emptied for the last time, the case refused to settle into the past the way everyone expected it to. It lingered in conversations, in training rooms, in the quiet moments when someone hesitated before turning away from trouble. The cold case had ended on paper, but its echo moved differently, less like a conclusion and more like a low-frequency hum beneath the city's daily noise. For the victim's family, life did not snap back into place. There was no clean line between before and after, no sudden peace delivered by a judge's gavel. What changed was the shape of the grief. It was no longer suspended in uncertainty. It had edges now, sharp ones, defined by facts spoken out loud. They knew what had happened, or enough of it to stop imagining worse possibilities, and that knowledge was both a burden and a strange kind of anchor. The not knowing had been torture. The knowing was something else entirely. In the neighborhoods touched by the case, people began to revisit their own memories of the early 90s, the way the city had felt then, dangerous and loud, everyone learning how to survive by keeping their heads down. Some defended the silence, saying it was a different time, that fear was rational, that the rules were unwritten but understood. Others rejected that excuse, insisting that the line between survival and complicity had always been clear, even if crossing it felt safer. Law enforcement agencies quietly absorbed the lessons. Cold cases were re-examined with new eyes, not just for missed suspects, but for missed moments, for signs that inaction itself had shaped outcomes. Training manuals changed language. Detectives were reminded that crimes don't always hinge on a single act, that sometimes the most consequential decision is the one not to intervene. The case became a reference, not as a triumph, but as a cautionary tale. The man who had made the call at 2:17 a.m. faded from public view, his role reduced to a paragraph in the story, but his choice remained the pivot on which everything turned. Without that call, the silence might have held indefinitely. The truth might have stayed fragmented, hidden behind time and fading memories. Whatever his motives had been, guilt, fear, calculation, or all three, the result was irreversible. Once spoken, the past could no longer pretend to be settled. Years later, the apartment where it began would change hands again, its walls bearing no visible trace of what happened inside. Someone would cook dinner there, laugh there, sleep there, unaware that the space had once been the center of a moral collapse that rippled outward for decades. Cities are good at that, at building over their own scars, at convincing themselves that what can't be seen no longer matters. But the case lived on in subtler ways. In the hesitation before someone closed a door. In the moment a witness decided to stay instead of leaving. In the pause before silence. It reminded people that time does not erase responsibility, it only postpones the reckoning, and that postponement has a cost measured not just in years, but in lives reshaped by absence. In the end, the cold case was never really about who struck the fatal blow. It was about how many people stood close enough to stop it and chose not to, how fear can become a language spoken fluently by a group without anyone agreeing to speak it. It exposed the uncomfortable truth that evil does not always arrive loudly. Sometimes it waits, quietly, for everyone to look away at the same time. And so the story closed not with certainty, not with satisfaction, but with a warning etched into the city's memory. That when the moment comes, when action feels dangerous and silence feels safe, the choice made in that instant may not reveal its consequences for years or decades, but it will reveal them eventually. The cold case taught that lesson too late for one life, but not too late to matter, leaving behind an echo that asks the same question again and again, long after the headlines have faded. The question didn't end with the last line of testimony or the final broadcast recap. It traveled. It followed people home, sat with them in the quiet after the TV went dark, surfaced weeks later in unrelated moments when a decision hovered just long enough to feel heavy. The case had crossed that invisible line where a crime story stops being about the crime and starts being about everyone who hears it. In police academies, instructors referenced it without drama, stripping it down to timelines and decisions, pointing to the empty spaces between actions. They talked about opportunity costs, about how delay can harden into destiny. Recruits listened, some nodding, some skeptical, all imagining themselves in cleaner situations, clearer moments. None of them wanted to believe they might freeze the way others had frozen years earlier. None of them wanted to imagine fear masquerading as reason. Journalists revisited their own archives. Old notes, missed calls, stories that never ran because confirmation never came. The case forced an uncomfortable self-audit. How many times had caution edged into avoidance? How often had uncertainty become a convenient stopping point? The line between responsible reporting and quiet retreat suddenly looked thinner than anyone liked to admit. For the family, anniversaries changed again. They were no longer marked by hope that answers might arrive, nor by the dull ache of certainty that they wouldn't. Instead, each year reopened a different wound, the knowledge that what happened was preventable in a dozen small ways. Justice had a face now, a sentence, a set of legal conclusions, but prevention remained hypothetical, a map drawn after the terrain had already claimed its victim. The city moved on, as cities always do, absorbing the story into its mythology of hard lessons learned and mistakes not to be repeated. New scandals took over headlines. New tragedies demanded attention. But occasionally, in a late-night segment or a long-form podcast episode, the case resurfaced, not as breaking news, but as a reminder. The tone was quieter, the language more reflective. The shock had cooled into something colder, heavier. Some of the original witnesses refused interviews forever. Others spoke once, carefully, their words measured, as if too much honesty might collapse the fragile structure they'd built around their past decisions. They talked about fear, about not knowing what was really happening, about how quickly minutes can disappear when you're waiting for someone else to act first. They rarely said the word cowardice. Silence didn't need that label to be loud. Technology advanced. Surveillance expanded. The idea that something like this could happen again seemed less plausible on the surface. Cameras everywhere. Phones always recording. Alerts instant. But the case lingered as proof that tools don't make choices, people do. Evidence can be abundant and still ignored. Signals can be clear and still dismissed. Modernity didn't guarantee courage. In academic circles, the case entered discussions of bystander effect and collective responsibility, cited alongside studies and experiments that tried to quantify hesitation. Students debated it in classrooms, arguing whether individuals could really be blamed when the environment itself encouraged inaction. The debate rarely ended cleanly. It wasn't supposed to. Easy conclusions were the enemy of the lesson. Years passed. The principal figures aged out of relevance. Some retired. Some died. The story outlived them all. It existed independently now, detached from faces, distilled into a sequence of moments that could be replayed endlessly. A door not opened. A call not made. A choice deferred until it was too late to matter. On quiet nights, in that part of the city where the streets narrow and the noise thins, the past felt closer. Not as a ghost story, not as superstition, but as a pressure, a sense that history doesn't disappear, it waits. It waits for someone to listen closely enough to hear what it's been saying all along. The cold case had been solved, yes, but resolution turned out to be a misleading word. What closed was a file. What remained open was a question about responsibility that refused to age out, refused to fade. It asked to be answered not once, but repeatedly, in real time, whenever the circumstances aligned just enough to test someone's resolve. And somewhere, someone heard a sound through a wall, or saw something out of place, or sensed that moment when intervention might matter. They paused. They remembered a story they once heard, a case that taught a lesson the hard way. And in that pause, the true ending of the case was still being written. Time kept moving, indifferent to the weight people attached to the story, but the case followed its own clock, resurfacing whenever society convinced itself that it had become smarter, safer, more responsive. Each resurgence carried the same uncomfortable implication. Progress is fragile, and memory is selective. The city that once swore never again had already forgotten the exact shape of the promise. In court transcripts and archived recordings, the voices remained frozen, stripped of context, preserved like insects in amber. Pauses stretched unnaturally long. Words landed harder than they had in real time. Listening back, investigators noticed things they had missed before, not new evidence, but new meaning. Hesitation disguised as uncertainty. Compliance framed as neutrality. The language of avoidance was suddenly obvious once the outcome was known. Families unrelated to the original victim began reaching out, drawn by parallels they couldn't ignore. Different streets, different years, same pattern. A moment when someone could have stepped in, called out, disrupted the flow of events, and didn't. The case became connective tissue, linking stories that had once felt isolated. It suggested something systemic, something deeper than individual failure. Psychologists spoke about moral distance, about how violence feels less real when it happens behind walls, filtered through muffled sounds and partial glimpses. They explained how the brain looks for excuses, how it searches for ambiguity to justify doing nothing. The science made sense. It was neat, explanatory, but it didn't make the outcome easier to accept. Understanding why people failed didn't undo the failure. The victim's name appeared less often in headlines now, replaced by phrases like the landmark cold case or the precedent-setting investigation. The person at the center of it risked becoming abstract, a symbol instead of a life interrupted. Those who knew them pushed back against that drift, reminding anyone who would listen that this wasn't a case study first. It was a human loss. Everything else came second. In the neighborhoods closest to the crime, younger residents learned the story, the way people learn urban legends, piecemeal, slightly distorted. Details blurred. Dates shifted. But the core remained intact. Something terrible happened, and people nearby heard it, and nothing stopped it. The story survived because it was simple enough to retell and unsettling enough to remember. Officials occasionally cited the case when announcing new initiatives, new hotlines, new protocols designed to catch danger earlier. Press conferences framed it as progress, as proof that lessons had been learned. Cameras flashed. Statements were made. And somewhere in the back of the room, someone always wondered whether the next test would come quietly, without warning, far from microphones and prepared remarks. The man who had finally spoken had long since disappeared into the machinery of the system, processed, categorized, reduced to a line in a database. His decision remained disproportionate to his presence. One sentence spoken decades late had altered the historical record, shifted blame, and forced a reckoning that no one could avoid once it began. Silence had shaped the crime. Speech had reshaped its aftermath. As years layered themselves over the event, the emotional temperature cooled, but the case never became neutral. It resisted detachment. There was always an edge to it, a sense that it wasn't finished asking what it came to ask. Each retelling carried an implicit challenge, daring the listener to imagine themselves inside that moment, stripped of hindsight, forced to choose. The cold case had started as a mystery of facts, of who did what and when. It ended as a question of character, of thresholds and limits, of how much discomfort a person is willing to endure to prevent harm to someone else. That question had no statute of limitations. And so the story persisted, not because of what was solved, but because of what it exposed. A reminder that the most dangerous gaps are not always in evidence or procedure, but in courage. That the difference between tragedy and interruption can be measured in seconds, and that those seconds are often filled with doubt. Somewhere, the city listened to itself breathe, unaware of when it might be tested again. The cold case waited, not as an unsolved crime, but as a warning, patient and persistent, ready to surface the next time silence felt easier than action. By the time the case reached its third decade in public consciousness, it had shed the urgency of news and taken on the weight of folklore. Not the kind told for entertainment, but the kind passed along as caution, as inherited memory. It no longer needed fresh details to survive. Its power came from repetition, from the quiet recognition that the conditions which allowed it to happen had never fully disappeared. In interviews conducted years later, people who lived nearby at the time described the night in fragments. A sound they couldn't quite place. A feeling that something was wrong, but not wrong enough to justify vmешательство. They spoke about the cold, about the late hour, about being tired, distracted, preoccupied with their own lives. None of it sounded monstrous. That was the most unsettling part. The explanations were ordinary, relatable, human. Sociologists pointed out how quickly responsibility dissolves when it is shared, how easily it spreads thin enough to feel weightless. When everyone is close enough to act, no one feels close enough to blame themselves. The case became a textbook example, but textbooks couldn't reproduce the texture of the night itself, the uncertainty, the half-formed thoughts, the internal negotiations that happen in seconds and define years. The victim's absence remained tangible to those who loved them. Empty chairs at gatherings. Stories that stopped mid-sentence because there was no one left to finish them. Closure, people realized, was a word used mostly by those watching from the outside. Inside, there was only adaptation, a slow learning process that never fully resolved into peace. Occasionally, a new tip would surface, sparked by a documentary rerun or a podcast episode that stirred old memories. Investigators followed each one carefully, methodically, even knowing that the chances of uncovering something new were slim. The act of listening had become part of the responsibility the case demanded. Ignoring it now felt like repeating the original failure in a different form. The city's physical landscape changed again. New buildings rose. Old ones came down. The streets where the story began were repaved, renamed, reimagined. But maps have long memories if you know how to read them. Beneath the new layers, the old coordinates remained, marking a point where something irreversible had occurred. In quiet moments, the case resurfaced in the minds of those who had studied it the longest. Detectives who had since retired admitted it was the one that stayed with them, not because of its complexity, but because of its simplicity. Nothing about it required genius to prevent. Only presence. Only intervention. Only the willingness to disrupt the moment. The language around the case softened over time. Words like shock and outrage gave way to reflection and lesson. But the emotional core remained unchanged. The realization that the line between safety and harm can be alarmingly thin, and that crossing it often involves nothing more dramatic than choosing not to act. Younger generations encountered the story without the raw fear that defined its early coverage. For them, it was history. But history, when told honestly, has a way of collapsing distance. They listened, and some of them asked the question that lingered beneath every retelling. Would it happen again? The answer was never simple, never reassuring. The cold case had transformed from a single narrative into a mirror, reflecting the values of whoever looked into it. Some saw proof that systems fail. Others saw evidence that individuals matter more than structures. Most saw an uncomfortable combination of both. The case refused to take sides. It only presented the consequences. As the years continued to stretch forward, the story did what unresolved stories always do. It waited, not for new evidence, not for another confession, but for the next moment when its lesson might be tested in real time. It waited in the spaces between noise and silence, between safety and risk, between noticing and responding. And somewhere in that waiting, the cold case remained unfinished in the only way that truly mattered, still asking whether the next person to hear something wrong would decide that this time, doing nothing was no longer an option. The story never announced itself when it returned. It slipped in quietly, through unrelated headlines, through late-night conversations, through that faint tightening in the chest when someone sensed a situation tipping toward danger. The cold case had become less a memory than a reflex, an involuntary comparison that surfaced whenever uncertainty asked to be ignored. In community meetings and classrooms, the case was discussed not as a relic, but as a scenario. Instructors stripped away names and dates, presenting it as a sequence of choices. What would you do here? What would you do now? The exercise was uncomfortable by design. It forced participants to confront the gap between intention and action, between what people believe about themselves and what they might actually do when fear sharpens and time compresses. Some listeners rejected the premise outright. They insisted they would have acted, that they were different, braver, less constrained by the pressures of the past. Others were quieter, more hesitant. They recognized themselves too clearly in the uncertainty, in the rationalizations that sounded reasonable until they weren't. The case divided audiences along that fault line, optimism on one side, self-awareness on the other. The victim's story continued to circulate in art and media, not always accurately, sometimes clumsily, but always with gravity. Filmmakers avoided reenactments, wary of sensationalism. Writers focused instead on atmosphere, on the way tension accumulates without obvious cues, on how danger can masquerade as ambiguity. The challenge was always the same: how to convey that nothing obvious was wrong until everything was. In law enforcement circles, the case influenced policy in subtle ways. Emphasis shifted toward early intervention, toward empowering officers and civilians alike to trust instincts that felt inconvenient or socially awkward. The idea that it's better to be wrong than silent gained traction, though it remained easier to endorse in theory than to practice in life. The man whose words had cracked the case was rarely mentioned anymore. His confession had served its purpose, unlocking a sealed narrative, but it offered no comfort. It didn't redeem the years of silence. It didn't restore what was lost. It simply confirmed what many had suspected and feared, that the truth had been close all along, close enough to touch, and still allowed to slip away. As decades passed, the case settled into a strange permanence. It was no longer current, no longer shocking in the way fresh tragedies are. But it was durable. It endured because it refused to resolve into something neat or reassuring. It didn't end with a hero arriving in time. It ended with reflection, with discomfort, with the recognition that outcomes are often shaped long before anyone realizes a story has begun. On anniversaries, the city paused, briefly, acknowledging the past before returning to the present. Candles were lit. Names were spoken. Then the noise resumed. Life demanded attention. The case receded again, waiting for its next invocation, its next chance to remind someone that awareness without action is only half a response. The most unsettling legacy was how ordinary the circumstances remained. No elaborate conspiracy. No intricate puzzle. Just a sequence of moments where intervention felt optional until it was impossible. That ordinariness made the case portable. It could happen anywhere. It could happen again. And so the cold case continued to do what it had always done best. It stayed. It lingered at the edge of attention, patient and persistent, a quiet test of conscience replaying itself in countless variations. Each time someone noticed something wrong and weighed the cost of speaking up, the story stirred, unresolved not in the files, but in the choices people were still making. The case had taught many lessons, but it demanded one final acknowledgement, one that never aged out. That history doesn't just record what happened. It watches what happens next, measuring whether the silence that once defined a tragedy will be broken or repeated when it matters most.